Is My Hero Academia generic? Okay, wait. Before you jump down and dislike the video, hear me out. You most likely clicked on this video for one of two reasons. A, YouTube in all its infinite algorithm glory recommended it to you on a whim, or B, you were just scrolling along without a care in the world, looking for any video related to any anime or My Hero Academia in general. You saw the title of this video, and then clicked on it to either tell me I'm absolutely right, or to tell me that I'm an absolute idiot who doesn't get how truly genius the show is, and how it's the purest form of art ever created. Listen, whatever reason you have for coming here, just hear me out. Just humor me for 6 to 10 minutes, give or take, depending on how long this script is going to end up being. If after all that, you still feel like I'm talking crap, go ahead and dislike the video and leave a comment telling me I'm an idiot. Okay? Okay, good. Anyway, with that out of the way, let me do my little intro and then we can jump right into this. Hello everyone and welcome to the Void Theater. As always, I'm your host, Alexander Shade. Alright, so let's talk about My Hero Academia. Now normally in my videos I do a little intro and maybe a brief history of the show, explain how it started, the main characters, its general premise. But this is really a show that needs no introduction. Even if you're new to the anime world, you've realistically heard of this show. For better or for worse, it cemented itself as one of the more iconic animes of the recent decade. Something that's even more impressive considering the anime could be seen as pretty generic. Now, I know on the surface that seems like an insult, but let me make one thing very clear. Generic does not mean bad. Me calling the show generic doesn't mean that the show in and of itself is a bad show. It just means that it follows a more traditional and standard way of telling its story, and again, that's not a bad thing. Plenty of things are generic and follow a determined set of rules. It just so happens that My Hero tends to follow nearly all the rules of a typical shonen anime. Now after hearing that, you would assume I'm about to spend the next however many minutes I have talking about how the show brings nothing to the table and is just another trash anime. But the truth is, I think the fact that My Hero is so generic is honestly one of its strongest suits. See, while the show itself is most of the time pretty basic, it really shines when it finds a way to break out of the typical shonen mold or even find a way to put a fresh take on the genre by mixing in some of the elements and tropes from comic books. So with that being said, let's look at the show and see just where it falls. I suppose the best place to start with the show would be with the villains of the series. Now, surprise surprise, when it comes to My Hero, there are a lot of villains. Like, a ton of villains. Like, a lot. Like, way more than the show actually needs a lot. But I want to talk about the main big bad. No, not you, you edgy little bastard. We'll get to you later in the video. I want to talk about the real big bad of the show, All For One. Now, there's a lot of reasons to like All For One. Amazing design, cool powers, looks good in a suit. I know what I said. I'm not apologizing. My point being that All For One is a villain. There's no secret altruistic goal for what he's doing. He's not actually a good guy who simply made some bad choices. He's a generic ass villain. And guess what? He's one of the best characters in the show. Yeah, I realize I'm probably in the minority of the fan base here, but All For One is definitely top contender for my favorite character in the show. Every time he's in an episode, he adds this level of evil to it, and it really works because he's just the standard definition of a villain. It's kind of the same reason Frieza is so beloved in Dragon Ball Z. Sure, Cell had the charm of an old gentleman villain, and Boo fits into that crazy out-to-kill-everything vibe, but there's just something about an honestly terrible person that just hits the right spot. Maybe it's the fact that behind that smile you know there's no real emotion behind it. It's a perfect reflection of the smile All Might has, where his is one that's built to ensure people always feel warm and safe around him. All For One smile is one that only exists to solely trick you into thinking he has any genuine feelings for anyone or anything beyond himself. But on the other hand, I think that's also what makes him so enjoyable to watch. You know you don't have to care for him and just be excited to see what new terrible thing they're going to end up doing. It plays itself as a nice sharp contrast to Shigaraki, who seems to be leaning into the tragic villain archetype that's growing in ever increasing popularity. All For One is a perfect example of a genuine cliche that isn't broken, so why fix it? Speaking of broken things, let's talk about Shigaraki. So remember how I was just talking about the tragic villain archetype in the last sentence? Well, Shigaraki is what would happen if you took Thanos from the MCU and actually gave him a real reason to be a sympathetic character. Boy, I am really just pissing every fandom off with this video. Anyway, the reason I bring up the Jolly Purple Giant is because there's a very thin line between a tragic villain and a heroic villain. And because Shigaraki follows every trope for a tragic villain like he's reading it out of a goddamn rulebook, he hits every single note on the "Am I a generic anime villain" checklist without even trying. And yet, between him and Thanos, Shigaraki actually comes off as a more compelling character. See, the whole point of a tragic villain is that you're supposed to feel for them, but not want to see their goals completed. Now, when it comes to Shigaraki, he ends up embodying that theme perfectly. You realize that his dream would mean pretty much the end of all of Japan, and he needs to be taken out, but it's this sort of hollow thought because you're constantly shown why he is the way he is. Now, compared to the way Thanos' past is talked about in the MCU, it's treated as more of a secondary thought than anything that could have been used to justify his actions. Instead, it's just a throwaway line and it's never treated as anything more than that. Now, that isn't to say that Shigaraki's past is anything new or groundbreaking, groundbreaking. Honestly, he's not even the only white-haired edgelord with daddy issues to come out in the last 5 years. But he really doesn't have to be. Like All for One, it's following a standard trope and adding its own characters to make it fit the show and its themes, and it really just works. It's the main reason why so many people in the My Hero fandom want to see him get a redemption. They want to see Shigaraki get a chance at a better life the same way Deku does, and why, unlike certain other characters in the show, a majority of fans believes he actually deserves it. Alright, so you can't really talk about My Hero without addressing it, so let's talk about the Todoroki family and its resident psycho, Dobby. You know, it's kinda weird. I don't really think you can get to a more diversive character than Dobby when it comes to My Hero fans. On one hand, you have people who think he's the pinnacle of My Hero, and then anyone who doesn't like him just doesn't get how good he is. On the other hand, you have the fans of the show who just wish the Dobby fans would shut up for 5 minutes and let people enjoy other characters. Me personally, I actually enjoy authentic anime Zuko and Azula. Oh, boom me all you want, you know it's true. Okay, look, lower your pitchforks for a minute. I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but it is a noticeable thing, and a pretty standard trope. But keep in mind what I said earlier. Standard and generic don't mean bad, they just mean by the number. Now with that being said, is Dobby's character arc generic? Well, yes and no. The whole reveal of him being Endeavor's son was definitely predictable, but that's not really the same as being generic, so I don't think I can count that against him. But that's not to say that the characters don't have some obvious similarities. Let's see, we have an asshole dad with power, fire abilities, and terrible facial hair. We have a son with a scar on half his face trying to outstep his father's shadow and make sure he never ends up like him, and a psycho sibling who just wants mommy and daddy to love them again. So yeah, not exactly the most original concept. That being said, we really can't talk about Dobby without addressing the flaming elephant in the room, so let's talk about the Endeavor redemption arc. Now, just bear with me, I know this seems like a random subject change, but let me explain. When it comes to family arcs like this, there are two things that are usually seen. A, it's typically the kid who has to go on a redemption arc himself, either for the honor of his family or just for himself. See the Zuko reference above, or think Trunks if that's more your speed. And B, it's rare for the redemption to be focused on the villain trying to do good. You see where I'm going with this. My Hero decided to go against the grain here and make an entire, well, I said arc earlier, but I don't think that quite fits. Storyline? I'm gonna call it a storyline. No, I'm not gonna talk about whether redeeming Endeavor is a good idea. That's an entirely different video, and frankly, this one is gonna be long enough as it is. But on that note, leave a comment down below if you want to see me make a video on Endeavor and his redemption. Also, while you're down there, please make sure to like and subscribe for more content. Look, don't you judge me. I do what I gotta do. Anyway, the point isn't about whether he deserves it or not, that falls on you and how you feel about the character. But I will say that the entire concept and execution of his redemption is probably one of My Hero's least generic ideas. It takes a pretty standard concept and finds a way to not only tie it into the hero's personal life, but also make it have an impact on the entire setting of the story. Now Endeavor's redemption isn't just about whether or not he can prove himself to his family, but also whether he can prove to Japan that he's fit to take over the spot as the #1 hero. It also does a good job of turning the whole trope on its head. Instead of being treated to the more generic idea of telling the kid to learn to master their power and prove themselves to the villain, we're now shown the exact opposite. A former villain almost trying to prove that he can be a hero. It's a pretty unique take that only gets more interesting when you realize the roles have been reversed for Dobby as well. Going back to the Zuko comparison, his entire arc in the first book was the desire to reclaim his honor and prove that he could be as ruthless as his father despite his more passive nature. But here we see the exact opposite as Endeavor tries to prove that he can be a loving father and a true hero despite his violent and abusive nature. It's a unique take on the concept as it provides the viewer with a serious question. With Zuko, we were always shown his caring side and we were always given examples of his more compassionate nature. Endeavor, on the other hand, has only ever demonstrated a cruel, sadistic, and abusive nature. So can he actually be redeemed? Or on a more serious question, does he deserve his own redemption? Dobby, on the other hand, was forced to live to absurd expectations only to be tossed to the side the second a better child was born. It broke him and he became desperate to prove he could strive to be like his father even if it killed him. It feels like a much more rapid version of Azula's own descent into madness. It's definitely a rehashed idea, but it's a solid one that ties Dobby into the rest of the villains, and I feel like that's the point. Like Shigaraki, none of Dobby's past justifies his actions, but it does provide context for the way he acts while also acting as another thing you're forced to consider when it comes to the idea of Endeavor's redemption. Now we just have to find a way to convince half the fandom to not jump to conclusions with the character. Okay, so that went on a lot longer than I thought it would, but we're nearing the home stretch, so let's wrap it up by talking about Green Naruto. God, that joke faded fast, didn't it? Anyway, what is there to say about Deku? Well, I suppose a good place to start with is the fact that out of every character I talked about in this video, he has the distinct honor of being the most generic of the bunch. He's essentially a mashup of every comic book sidekick trope all blended together. Now, at this point, you're probably expecting me to tell you about how this is bland and uninspired and blah blah blah. And yeah, in a certain type of way, it is. But like Shigaraki and All for One, Deku following these tropes and cliches works for the story. The whole point of Deku is that he's a stereotypical comic book sidekick who has to grow into his own hero. Think something like Nightwing or Dick Grayson. The whole point of characters like them is that they're naive at the beginning and they learn as they go. For Grayson, it was starting off as Robin and then eventually growing into the Nightwing persona and then becoming Batman in his own right. And for Deku, it's learning how to not only be the last wielder of One for All, but also learning how to use all the powers that come with it so he can rise above the legacy All Might left him as the former holder of the quirk. Again, it's nothing too original, but for a show that's essentially functioning like a comic book in anime form, it fits. It doesn't really do anything too creative, but that kind of feels like the point. The show obviously takes a lot of inspiration from comic books and comic movies, and those are just as generic. But with the MCU movies lacking complexity, they make up in charm, and Deku is the exact same way. Okay, look, we can all be honest here. We know how this show is going to end. It's a shonen anime. It's not exactly going to reinvent the wheel here, but every good shonen needs to have a likable protagonist, and as simple as Deku is, he's also insanely likable. It's kinda hard to not want to cheer for him, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's so genuinely honest in his aspirations. He honestly believes that anyone can find some sort of redemption and try to be a better person. It's the same type of hopefulness that made characters like Goku and Superman so iconic. It's easy to make a gritty, angsty superhero, but to make a character that genuinely feels like they want to make the world a better place is a much more interesting challenge, and the fact that Deku finds a way to do it without coming off as tiresome is honestly really impressive. So with all that being said, the question still remains, is My Hero Academia generic? Well, sorta. The show is honestly weird in how it handles itself. It takes standard shonen tropes like the typical power friendship stuff you usually see and mixes it in with the standard comic book tropes into some weird amalgamation that somehow just works. So yeah, I guess it is generic, but is that really a bad thing? I think one of the best things about the show is the fact that it knows it's generic and that it uses it to work in the show's favor. See, while it follows a lot of the standard anime and comic book formats, it mixes them in a way that on its own is wholly unique to My Hero's identity. It really helps the show stand out and carve its own place with the other shonen animes out there. Even the recent UA trade arc isn't anything too far out there, but it's helped by the fact that it acts almost like a mini comic arc. It wasn't a dominating storyline like the League of Villains going against the Liberation Front, but it was this overarching storyline that honestly had me coming back to the manga just to see if they revealed who the traitor was. It felt like it was paying homage to those overarching stories you usually see in comic books. Even if the traitor was predicted 2 years ago, it still made for an interesting story. But that's kind of My Hero in a nutshell. It's an anime that, like Dragon Ball, is more about the journey than the destination. You know the heroes are going to win and you know it will end with everything being okay, but you stick around because you want to see how they get there. And that's okay. Like I said earlier in the video, generic doesn't mean bad. It just means the show follows certain story bumps and similar themes. And with My Hero, they found a way to make that work to its advantage, cliches and all. Alright, with all that being said, we're going to wrap up this video looking at My Hero Academia and its positives and negatives. If you did like the video, then again, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and leave a comment letting me know what you think of My Hero Academia and its story, characters, and plot lines. Until then, once again, I've been your host, Alexander Shade, and I hope to see you back in my theater.